Hey, it's Mary. Welcome back to my channel where I share with you tips that I've learned on my writing journey to help you on yours. Today we're going to be talking about literary genres. That's exciting stuff. No, really though, it kind of is. There's a lot that goes into it. If you are a writer or a consumer of stories in any way, you probably have heard of literary genres. You might think you know about them enough to the point where I don't need to learn anymore. I know mystery, I know fantasy, I know sci-fi. If you hear my cat, it's because he's trying to catch a bird through the window right now. He's kind of an idiot. But anyway, there's a lot to literary genres that people probably don't know. And even if you're a writer, you might not know about this until further down your writing journey. And that point is right now, my friend, because I'm going to tell you. But yeah, before we get into it, make sure that you are subscribed so that you never miss a video with tips and tricks for how to be a better writer. I also post content just revolving around books and writing in general. It's not always tips and advice. Sometimes it's just about what I'm reading or fun little stuff. I kind of like having the laptop and screen. Or do we not like that? No, we don't like that, actually. Anyway, the main reason why you should learn about literary genres is because it will impact how your book is marketed to readers and also... Hold on, I gotta turn this heater off. I'm a little bit spastic today. I'll get there. This is gonna be a ride. It will impact how your book is marketed to readers as well as to agents and publishers. According to Oxford Research Encyclopedias, genre describes a grouping of texts related within the system of literature by their sharing recognizably functional features of form and content. This is saying that genres help us categorize literary works based on similar features. The four overarching categories of literature are fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and drama. Fiction is what we know it as, obviously. I hope you know what fiction is, and nonfiction. Poetry is poetry, and drama is what you would think of when you hear Shakespeare. You know what I mean? Like the Greek tragedies. Those are dramas. It's typically like a play, but it's focused on the literary aspect and not the presentation aspect. If I'm wrong, feel free to correct me in the comments. That is not my area of expertise. And that is why I'm going to be focusing on fiction in this video, because it's what I'm familiar with. I'm not going to talk about nonfiction genres or poetry. I don't even know if poetry has genres, to be quite honest. I'm not a poet. If you're interested in those, feel free to research them on your own. I will not be helping you on that. So sorry. Now, when I say genre, as I've already mentioned, you're probably thinking fantasy, mystery, romance. And you know what? You would be right. So let's delve into those right now and summarize what each one looks like. According to Lisa Wood, a graduate and undergraduate English and Literature instructor at SNHU, which is the Southern New Hampshire University, genre fiction is usually plot-based commercial fiction. This means that it's written for easy-to-read mass appeal. Book Riot, which is an independent editorial site, listed the top 10 literary genres as of mid-2024 as romance, fantasy, science fiction, memoir or biography, children and young adult, true crime, mystery and thriller, historical fiction, self-help, and historical nonfiction. And since I already mentioned that I won't be talking about anything that isn't fiction, we can cross out all of those. And real quick, it's important for me to know, cross genres, it's the practice of mixing two or more genres to create a mixed genre. It's the main reason why fantasy and romance are both blowing up because of the recent surge in romantasy, a made-up word that basically just describes cross-genre of those two genres. Now, authors have gravitated towards romantasy either because they enjoy the genre or they are capitalizing on the profitability of it because it's so popular. Let's just crank out a bunch of really cheap written books and then sell them, and man, we're gonna make bank. So who knows what the reason is. Anyway, there has been a surge, and it has saturated the market with similar titles. Prominent authors of this are Rebecca Yarros, who authored Fourth Wing, also Sarah J. Maas, who is the author of ACOTAR, Court of Thorns and Roses. I won't say that Maas was the first to do this, because I highly doubt she was, actually, but I do think that her writing style and the stories that she gravitates towards writing have propelled the genre farther. Propelled it into the mainstream. I do think she was a bit of a trendsetter in that way. But yeah, now we're getting so many romantasy books that they all bleed together into one homogenous glob of titles that all share at least one word, whether that word is blood, raven or crow, ash, dagger or sword, king or queen. The titles are all the same. Did I mention the copious amounts of graphic sex in these books? Oh my gosh. Save me now. But there are other cross genres, and most of them don't focus on smut. So if that's not your thing, don't worry. Like slipstream fiction, a genre which blends fantasy and sci-fi, and it can be surreal and jarring. It often involves time travel and multiverses and parallel worlds. More examples of cross genres in fiction: The Martian, which is a sci-fi horror book. Then you have Cloud Atlas, which is a sci-fi historical or historical sci-fi. I feel like historical is supposed to come first in that description. The Name of the Rose, which is historical mystery. And I would also count Divine Rivals as historical romantasy. The plot mainly focuses on the romance between the two main characters, while still having a tangible plot and world set apart from it. It's a duology, so the story is a bit more complex than just two people falling in love. It takes place in an alternate World War I, which began after two gods decided to duke it out for some reason. There's magical elements, but it's also set in the real world, like cars and stuff, so it's kind of cool. So anyway, as I get into this list of genres, just remember that they are not exclusive and they oftentimes overlap. Stories do not fit neatly into just one genre. They're like different colors of the rainbow. And when you're writing a book, whatever genre you choose that book to be is going to be one color, and you can stick to writing your book in all green pages, like mystery, or you can add in blue and pink to those green pages and have it be a colorful, multicolored book with mystery, historical, fantasy elements. It is seriously up to you. Now, let's get into the big kahuna of it all. Let's start with romance. Romance is one of the hottest genres right now. And you know what? It always has been hot, because girls love to consume, and you know what? Period. Genre focuses on the love and relationships between two people. It usually ends with a satisfying ending where the couples get together, because that's the point of the book. Romance, like I said, absolutely dominates the industry right now. The difference is the old romance books, 80s ones that you find on the store bookshelves, those were dingy. Now the romance books are being sold as cute and aesthetic. They're meet cutes. They're not, well, you know what? A lot of them are unsettling. We'll still make fun of them. As Sumi, I think everything should be made fun of. You can't argue the relevance of the genre since it has a grip like a gorilla. In 2024 alone, romance novels accounted for 30% of fictional books sold. Which is a huge jump from the year before, which was just 23%. You can attribute this to Colleen Hoover or Ali Hazelwood. They're two of the biggest names in the genre. I'm sure you've heard of Colleen Hoover, though, before, and if you haven't heard of her, I'm sure you've heard of Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. I'm not really a fan of the genre personally. I prefer romance to be a subplot because, as I've said in recent videos, I love longing. I love when the characters just never get together. But I have read my fair share of fanfics. I'm not going to deny that. Now, as far as subgenres go, romance, like I said, can be applied to any of the other genres. So the possibilities are quite endless. It's very straightforward, really. You just pair romance with one of the other genres. Yay! That's not the same with fantasy. So fantasy, the big kahuna number 2, fantasy stories are often inspired by folklore and mythology, and are usually featuring magic, mythical creatures, and imaginary worlds. They can be high stakes, with world-ending epic battles and warring kingdoms like in Lord of the Rings, or they can be low stakes and focus on a small corner of a fictional world that you've crafted. Humanity has always adored stories set in different worlds. I think because there's a form of escapism there. Am I a psychologist? But ever since Lord of the Rings was published in 1954, the style of fantasy has ebbed and flowed consistently around wizards and witches and fae and fairies and elves. Oh, and dragons. You can't have a fantasy world without dragons nowadays. Some form of flying lizard. In the first half of 2024 alone, adult fantasy sales increased 85.2% from the year before in the same period. And that was only the first half of the year. Now, as far as why do I keep doing that? As far as subgenres go, there are quite a lot with fantasy, actually, unlike romance. Some of these include high fantasy, which is totally separate from our world, with totally different government systems and countries and species, and everything is completely different from our world, totally set apart. These usually have strict magic systems or very strict world building, like Lord of the Rings. Most epic fantasies take place in high fantasy world, and an epic fantasy is that end of the world story where you have to prevent the end of the world, like it's a big war between countries. Low fantasy is the opposite of high fantasy, often called intrusive fantasy. And it's as similar to our world as possible. So it might be set in a different world, but a lot of the elements are familiar. They're not trying to make it a strict new world. I just stopped my camera because my computer cannot handle, nor can my camera. Actually, none of my equipment can handle footage longer than 25 minutes. What was I saying? Oh, historical fantasy. Similar to contemporary fantasy in that it is set in our real world, in our current reality. However, it is set in the past. Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies would be an example of this because it is set in the late 1800s. And then you have dark fantasy, which is exactly what it sounds like. Imagine those dark fantasy animations from the 80s, like those old movies. That's dark fantasy, my dude. You have urban fantasy, which is set in urban environs, as the name suggests, and it usually has a contemporary feel, and it's usually set in our world, but dirtier and darker and grittier than contemporary books, because it focuses on urban areas, which not as whimsical as the countryside. And then you have grimdark. Whoa! That bird about ran right into our window. Fritz, did you see that? He did. Grimdark is dystopian fantasy. Also, imagine those fantasy animation movies from the 80s. And then the last subgenre I'm going to mention is weird fantasy. Weird fantasy pushes the boundaries of traditional fantasy with unconventional settings, characters, and plot lines, and often pulling from horror and sci-fi to make a Frankenstein story. There are endless combinations one could make, resulting in endless subgenres for any, but those are the ones for fantasy that most people know. Then we have science fiction. I like science fiction. I like writing science fiction a lot. I have trouble finding science fiction books that I like to read, which is a struggle when you're trying to write it. Science fiction uses scientific theory and fact to explore imagined worlds and innovation of technology. Think space travel and aliens and time travel and futuristic worlds. But then you also have cyberpunk, a concept that hinges on advanced futuristic technology and is growing in popularity with stories like Ready Player One. 2003 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles show was sci-fi, I think. Yeah, it's sci-fi. But then the 5th season, when they went into the future, that's like sci-fi. That's major sci-fi. I watched that last summer. Really good show. Holds up. Humanity is often a major theme in sci-fi stories because the contrast between technology and the advancement of humanity makes it really easy to contrast with the natural humanity and, the themes that come with how far is too far. You might have noticed that I didn't add dystopian to the genre list because dystopian is technically a subgenre of sci-fi, a setting which explores the consequences of scientific and technological advancement. So some other subgenres of this... Oh my gosh! So some other subgenres of this genre include hard sci-fi, which is kind of like high fantasy, where it prioritizes scientific accuracy and strict world building that is super separate from our world. And then you have low fantasy, low sci-fi, which is like and then you have soft sci-fi, which is like low fantasy. The world is just a backdrop for the story and the characters to unfold on. It doesn't have to be perfect because it isn't as relevant as it is in hard sci-fi. You have Afrofuturism, a cultural movement that blends African diaspora history and technology to explore the future. It's often expressed through music, art, and literature. You have alternative history, which is the what ifs and the parallel worlds. You know that what if series that Marvel did? That is alternative history, and it is sci-fi. All of Marvel is sci-fi, though. There is steampunk. Everyone knows steampunk. Steampunk is historical sci-fi set in the 19th century Victorian England. It's very recognizable. It doesn't branch off too often. We all know those goggles that people wear. And then the last one to mention is biopunk, which focuses on biotechnology, like cyborgs and the ethics of altering life. And there are more, of course, but those are what I'm going to mention. And I already mentioned cyberpunk and dystopian. Examples would be Ready Player One, as I've already mentioned, The War of the Worlds, Brave New World, Voltron fanfics. Mystery and thriller. So mystery and thriller and horror are all kind of lumped together, but they are different. We all know what horror is. I feel like I don't have to explain that too much. Mystery and thriller, however, are very similar, and I think they need to be differentiated. A mystery novel focuses on solving a crime. Whoa, shocker there. While a thriller novel, it focuses on the fear of a future crime. Thrillers are often more action-packed and emotional than mysteries are, while mysteries are more cerebral. Both mysteries and thrillers involve a crime and a main character who tries to solve it. Both include suspense and plot twists. Both can include horror, but like I said, mysteries tend to be more cerebral, with the villain remaining in the shadows, whereas in thrillers, the villain is often established early on. One is after a crime has taken place, and the other is before or during the crime taking place. But of course, they can be merged, they can be mixed. You can have thrilling mysteries and mysterious thrillers. Thriller is often a mix of mystery and horror, specifically, and plays on psychological fears. Whereas I would not say any Agatha Christie book has ever done that. Or those Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys books. Yeah, those are just fun little mystery books, you know? Like, you get to solve the mystery with the characters. The subgenres of mystery include, but are not limited to, noir, which is a French word. It's fun to say. Gritty and dark, and puts more emphasis on the psychology of the characters and criminals rather than the actual crime. You have those police detective stories, which are the classic whodunit mystery. You have capers, which is from the criminal's point of view, so the mystery is in plain sight. It's not hidden. High society would be a caper. But so would Six of Crows, right? They're both capers. Then you have historical mystery, but again, historical mystery can also be played with any of the other, so you can have historical detective stories. And then we have historical fiction. Yay! It's a literary genre where fictional narratives are set in the past, often incorporating real historical places and events, and sometimes people, aiming to provide an immersive, authentic experience of a specific time period. The characters are influenced by the customs and cultures of that time period. Authors are expected to be historically accurate. Like when people make TV shows set in the Regency period and then everyone dogs on them for the wardrobe inaccuracies on YouTube. I love those videos. So there is little leeway in what you admit or omit to the setting. But even though everything needs to be accurate, the story itself can be fictional. It can be an alternative telling to a true event or totally made up with made up characters. And yet again, this is another genre I don't gravitate towards. I do read historical fiction when it is cross-genred with another, like fantasy specifically, like Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies or Divine Rivals. But I don't seek these books out. I have Pride and Prejudice and other Jane Austen books on my shelf, and I've never read them. But that's not because they're historical. That's just because they're old. The writing is a drag to get through. I also have Little Women somewhere. Right there. Which I got halfway through that and then never finished, so I gotta finish that at some point. Some examples of historical fiction include The Help by Catherine Stockett, Wayward by Amelia Hart, The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. Whew! Whoa, that was long. Anyway, we're not done, so buckle up. You should have been buckled already. We're driving at fast speeds. Did you know the average word count varies depending on which genre a book is? Disclaimer though, this is not a science, nor is it a math, nor is it a strict rule, nor is it PE class. It's just a useful tool for determining whether your story needs more work. Fantasy and sci-fi tend to be longer than your average contemporary novel. A romance isn't likely to be longer than 100,000 words, sitting at usually a range of 70 to 90,000. Romance books just don't have very complex plots, and thus don't require the extra page space to lay out a story. The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood is roughly 82,500 words. It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover is roughly 100,000 words. So you can push the limits a little bit, you know? You don't have to stay within those bounds, but as I'll get into, you don't want to push it too far. With fictional worlds, my brain feels like a bowl of potato soup right now. With fictional worlds, Such like you would find in fantasy and sci-fi, there is an entire world you have to craft and convey to the reader because the reader isn't familiar with it. It's not going to be intuitive as it would be with a contemporary book. Of course, a fantasy book is going to run longer than To All the Boys I've Loved Before, which takes place in a boring high school with plain old teenagers. The range for fantasy and sci-fi is between 90 to 120,000 words. 90,000. I assumed you understood that, but sometimes you gotta clarify. There are dumb people on the internet. Epic fantasies can run even longer, like 200,000 words. If I remember correctly, Outlander is a crazy long book. I don't know if it's epic fantasy, but it's a crazy long book. War and Peace is also a really long book. Sci-fi runs between 80 to 120,000 words as well, so very similar to fantasy. The first book in a series is usually going to be shorter than the rest because you don't want to risk it all in the first book. It's a good idea to keep it shorter to ease your readers into the story. Also, publishers and agents tend to be a little by it because they think it's not going to do very well. They like, especially debut authors, to sit very clearly inside the lines of the standard for their demographic. A book that is too big might intimidate readers like me. Historical fiction runs between 80,000 to 100,000 words for the same reasons as romance, but with a little more room to work with since it is set in a different time period. Even if it's a period we're familiar with, there are still things the reader will have to learn in order to understand the world because it's somewhat foreign. Not as foreign as a totally different world, but it is more foreign than our current day. Not to mention the stories are a little more complex sometimes than your typical romance book, so there is more leeway. YA novels, which in general tend to sit between 60 to 90,000 words. Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, which was written for middle schoolers, is about 86,000 words, while the second book in the series is only 64,000 words, so it's definitely sitting on the lower end there. That being said, the older the demographic, the longer the books can be. You don't want to market a 500-page book to middle schoolers. They're not going to read that crap. For instance, The Hunger Games sits at about 99 to 100,000 words. It just depends on the weight of your story and how mature your audience is. I say all this not to flog you with a ton of information and to worry you about your own story. Please don't worry about your word count right now. If you're writing it, if you are in the midst of the first draft, don't worry about your word count. Just write your story. But I say this because if you've just completed your story, maybe you finished your first draft, or your second draft, or your third draft. Hopefully before your third draft, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. Let's say it's romance, and it sits at 120,000 words. That is well above the typical word count for that genre. Let's maybe consider cutting down on unnecessary moments and fluff within the story. You might be saying, oh, no, it's all necessary. You're wrong. If your story is a fantasy and the book sits at 200,000 words, give it a thorough run-through. It's not that these books can't be longer than their average word count. I've already mentioned that they can. It's that we don't want to make them longer than they have to be, especially if it makes the book an outlier in its own genre. When I finished my first draft, it's sci-fi, by the way, it had over 150,000 words, which is above the typical word count for my genre. It is about 30,000 words higher, actually. And it would also be the first book in a series, and it would be my debut novel. That is a big red flag to publishers and to agents. So even though I didn't want to, what did I do? I went back and I cut out 2 entire characters and an entire side plot, and I cut out those 30,000 words. Now it's about roughly 120,000 words, and I'm still trying to cut down on it more because still a bit on the high side, and I want it to be more even with the sequel, which is less than it. Please, if your story absolutely needs to be longer than the average word count, that's fine, but only if it's absolutely necessary. And I hate to break it to you, but it usually isn't necessary. You can usually cut down on stuff and make the story better. This isn't an insult. I'm not trying to crush your ego or crush your spirit. It's just the card hold truth. I feel that it's less of an issue for a story to be shorter than the average word count than longer, so I wouldn't stress about that. For one, it doesn't happen very often, but also because people don't hate short things as much as they hate long, drawn-out, boring things. The Queen of Nothing by Holly Black is almost 20,000 words less than its predecessor, The Cruel Prince, at approximately 90,000 words. The Wicked King, which is the final book in the trilogy, is at 87,000 words. I was shocked at how low the word count, like how short those books were when I first read them. But the thing is that even while I didn't love the books, I finished them. When a book is too long and drawn out and I don't like it as much, I just stop reading. I DNF it. So I think that's why it's not as big of an issue. No matter the story you write though, literally no matter what story it is, just make sure that there are no plot holes and that the pacing is smooth. A complete story is a complete story, whether it's 50,000 words or 150,000 words. So make sure yours is as tight as it can possibly be with as little room for error as you can get. No loose threads waving in the wind. All right, although I just filled you in on all the differences in the genres, and I didn't even touch on everything, so I'm planning on making a part 2. I don't want you to leave this video overly stressed and focused on your genre. Writing about genres is meant to assist you in your process, not hold you back. Don't worry about fitting your story neatly into a specific genre because you might overlook important things. Paul Whitcover, Associate Dean of Creative Writing at the Southern New Hampshire University, says, "Concepts of genre are more fluid than writers may believe." And it's true. Like I said, so many genres overlap. That's literally what subgenres are. It's just overlapping with other genres. And that is what I want to leave you with in this video. It's all I have for you today. Next week, I'll have more for you on the topic because I had to split this into 2 videos. We're already sitting at a very high length. I'll be talking about age genre, story type genre, and other terms you might not even know exist. So check back for that. Make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss it and you don't miss any future installments on my channel. And comment down below what your favorite genre to read is. I like fantasy and capers. I liked inheritance games, which is mystery because you're solving a mystery. Six of Crows, which is fantasy caper. And I like a good dystopian book when it's written well, like The Hunger Games. Can't deny that. So anyway, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. I'll see you in the next one. Stay creative.